Sometimes the people we lose leave behind more than memories. They leave behind questions we're not sure we want answered. Gretta Lowen was 58 years old when she learned her estranged grandfather had died and left her a cabin in the Cascade Mountains. She hadn't seen him in 30 years. The cabin had been locked up for 60. When she finally made the hike up that muddy trail, she expected to find nothing but dust and decay. Instead, she found metal boxes, old journals, and a hidden trapdoor under the floorboards. The rain started falling, the road washed out, and as night settled in around that lonely cabin, Gretta began to realize her grandfather had been keeping a secret all those years. What was he hiding up there in the mountains? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Gretta Lowen had spent most of her adult life learning to be comfortable with silence. At 58, she worked as a wilderness guide in the North Cascades, leading small groups of hikers through terrain that demanded respect and rewarded patience. She knew the mountains the way some people knew city streets, every switchback, every seasonal stream, every place where the light came through the trees just right in the late afternoon. She was good at her work, better than good. But she was also alone in ways that went deeper than geography. She lived in a small rental house outside of Marble Mount, a town so small it barely registered on most maps. No husband, no children, a handful of acquaintances who nodded to her at the general store but didn't ask personal questions. That was how she preferred it. She'd learned young that families were complicated, that closeness could turn painful, and that sometimes the safest distance was complete. Her mother had taught her that lesson, though not intentionally. Growing up, Gretta had watched her mother move through life like someone expecting bad news at any moment. There was always tension in the house, always a sense that something terrible was just around the corner. Her mother never explained it, never talked about the past, never mentioned Gretta's grandfather except in warnings. "Stay away from him," her mother would say, when Gretta asked why they never visited. "He made choices. We live with them apart." Gretta had been 7 the last time she'd seen her grandfather. She remembered a tall, quiet man with rough hands and eyes that seemed to look past her towards something she couldn't see. He'd lived alone even then, in a house that smelled like wood smoke and coffee. She remembered him teaching her to identify animal tracks in the mud, his voice low and patient. She remembered feeling safe with him in a way she didn't feel at home. Then they'd moved. Her mother packed up their life in the span of a week, and they relocated 3 hours south to Olympia. No explanation. No goodbyes. Gretta had asked about her grandfather once during the drive, and her mother's hands had tightened on the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. "We don't talk about him anymore." That was the end of it. Over the years, Gretta had wondered but never pushed. By the time she was old enough to seek him out on her own, she'd absorbed her mother's anxiety enough to stay away. She built her own life, chose solitude over the messiness of connection, and told herself she was content. The letter from the attorney had arrived on a Tuesday in late September. Her grandfather, Samuel Lowen, though she'd barely remembered his first name, had died at 89. The funeral had already happened. There was no request for her presence, no mention of her mother. Just a straightforward notification that Samuel Lowen had left property to his granddaughter Gretta. One cabin, remote, accessible only by foot, with specific instructions that it pass to her and her alone. The attorney's voice on the phone had been professionally neutral. "The cabin is about 8 miles up the Cascade River Road, then another 3 miles on foot. Your grandfather maintained it for years, though he hasn't visited in the last decade due to health. The property is yours to do with as you wish. There's no pressure to keep it." Gretta had thanked him and hung up. She'd sat at her kitchen table for an hour, the letter in front of her, trying to understand what she felt. Grief for a man she barely knew, anger at being pulled back into a past she'd walked away from, curiosity about why he'd left it specifically to her. She didn't attend the funeral. She told herself it was because she had work, clients depending on her. But the truth was simpler and harder. She didn't want to feel anything about Samuel Lowen. Feeling meant remembering, and remembering meant asking questions she'd spent 30 years avoiding. But the cabin remained. The letter remained. And after 2 weeks of trying to ignore both, Gretta had finally decided to hike up and see what she'd inherited. She told herself it was practical. She needed to assess the property, determine if it was worth keeping, or if she should just sell it and be done with the whole business. It was just a building, just wood and nails and whatever rot had accumulated over 60 years of neglect. She told no one she was going. She was used to solo trips into the back country, used to being out of contact for days at a time. She packed her standard gear: tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, water filtration, enough food for 3 days. The coordinates the attorney had provided led to a trail she knew well, or thought she did. She'd guided groups past this area dozens of times, but had never noticed any turnoff that might lead to a private cabin. The hike started easy. Late September meant the tourist crowds had thinned, and the morning air carried the first real bite of autumn. She moved at a steady pace, her body remembering the rhythm of uphill climbs, her mind deliberately blank. She didn't want to think about her grandfather or her mother, or the strange weight of inheriting something from a ghost. 3 hours in, she found the turnoff. It wasn't marked on any map she carried, just a narrow gap between 2 cedars where the undergrowth had been cleared at some point long ago. She almost missed it. Only the faint indentation of an old trail, now mostly reclaimed by ferns and salal, gave it away. She checked her GPS. This was the spot. The trail climbed steeply, switchbacking through dense forest. Whoever had built this path had known what they were doing. It followed the natural contours of the land, avoiding the worst of the erosion zones. But it hadn't been maintained in years. Gretta had to stop several times to clear fallen branches, and twice she lost the trail entirely, only finding it again by scanning ahead for the telltale break in the vegetation. After another hour, the forest opened up slightly. She could see sky through the canopy. And then, there it was. The cabin sat in a small clearing, hemmed in by Douglas firs and western hemlocks. It was smaller than she'd expected, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, with a pitched roof covered in moss and needles. The wood siding had weathered to a silver grey, and the single window facing the trail was so dirty it was nearly opaque. A stone chimney rose from one side, blackened with decades of smoke. But what caught her attention was the chain. A rusted chain hung across the narrow porch, attached to posts on either side. Looped through it was a padlock, old and oxidized but still intact. Beyond the chain, a hand-painted sign leaned against the cabin wall. Private property. No trespassing. It felt less like a boundary and more like a warning. Gretta stood at the edge of the clearing, her pack heavy on her shoulders, and tried to reconcile this place with the few memories she had of her grandfather. He'd been a forest ranger. She remembered that much. He'd spent his life in these mountains. But why seal up a cabin? Why lock it away and leave it to rot? She approached slowly, her boots quiet on the carpet of needles. The chain was secured with a combination lock, not a key lock. She tried the door anyway, locked from the inside, solid despite its age. The window was too dirty to see through clearly, but she could make out shapes inside. A table, chairs, something that might have been a bed. The attorney had sent her the combination in a sealed envelope, which she'd tucked into her jacket pocket. She pulled it out now, tore it open. 4 numbers, 3274. She spun the dial, heard the click as the lock released, and unwound the chain. It fell to the porch with a heavy thud that seemed too loud in the forest quiet. The door wasn't locked after all. The chain had been the only barrier. She pushed it open, hinges protesting with a long creak, and stepped inside. The smell hit her first. Dust, old wood, the faint mineral scent of stone. But beneath that, something else. Preserved air, like opening a jar that had been sealed for decades. The cabin was dark, the dirty window letting in only weak, filtered light. Gretta pulled out her flashlight and swept the beam across the interior. One room, a small wood stove in the corner, cold and empty. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed frame with a thin mattress that looked like it might disintegrate if touched. Shelves along one wall, mostly empty except for a few dusty jars, preserves maybe from another lifetime. A dry sink with a basin, a kerosene lamp on the table. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but nothing looked disturbed. No animal nests, no signs of water damage despite the moss-covered roof. It was as if someone had simply walked out one day and never returned, and the forest had respectfully left it alone. Gretta set her pack down by the door and moved deeper into the space. On the small mantel above the wood stove sat a pocket watch, its face stopped at 3:47. She picked it up carefully, wiped the dust away with her thumb. The back was engraved SL for Faithful Service, 1965. Her grandfather's watch. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the way time had literally stopped here. 3:47. Morning or afternoon? And which day? Which year? She set it back on the mantel and continued her exploration. The bed was pushed against the far wall. The shelves held a few more items she hadn't noticed at first. A tin cup, a plate, a handful of ancient paperback books with cracked spines. A drawer under the shelves was stuck, swollen with age and moisture. She pulled harder, and it finally gave way. Inside, old newspapers, yellowed and brittle. She lifted the top one carefully. The Skagit Valley Herald, July 1967. The headline was about a logging dispute. She set it aside and found more papers beneath, all from the same era, all carefully folded and preserved. And beneath those, a leather-bound journal. Gretta lifted it out slowly. The leather was cracked but intact, and when she opened to the first page, she found handwriting she didn't recognize. Careful, deliberate script in fading ink. Samuel Lowen, January 1962. Her grandfather's journal. She carried it to the table, brushed the dust off one of the chairs, and sat down. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up in the trees. A storm was coming. She could feel it in the air, see it in the way the light had gone flat and grey. She should set up her tent, get her camp organized before the weather turned. But instead, she opened the journal and began to read. The first entry was dated January 15th, 1962. Gretta read by the light of her flashlight, the beam steady on the yellowed pages. Cold today. Checked the north boundary line. Saw cougar tracks near Thornton Creek. All quiet otherwise. Standard ranger notes. Nothing unusual. She flipped forward, scanning entries. Most were similar. Weather observations, wildlife, sightings, maintenance notes about trails and markers. Her grandfather's voice came through in the spare, factual language, a man who watched and recorded, who moved through the forest with purpose. But as she moved deeper into the year, the tone began to shift. June 3rd, 1962. Checked the site. All quiet. No signs of disturbance. Weather holding. What site? Gretta flipped back through the previous entries, looking for context. Nothing. The phrase appeared suddenly, without introduction, as if her grandfather assumed the reader would understand. June 17th, 1962. Checked the site again. Someone had been near. Boot prints, recent. Covered the area more carefully. Must remain vigilant. July 2nd, 1962. Site secure. No one must know. The promise holds. Gretta read more slowly now, her attention sharpening. These weren't ranger notes. This was something else. Something private and deliberate. The entries continued through the summer and into fall, always brief, always using the same careful language. The site. The promise. No one must know. Then, in October, a longer entry that made her hands tighten on the journal. October 8th, 1962. Visited the site at dawn. The fog was thick. Good cover. I think about the girl often. She deserved better than this. We all did. But the decision was made, and I am bound by it. Some days I wonder if I chose wrong. Most days I know I did. But what's done cannot be undone. I can only keep watch and hope that, in time, the weight of this will ease. It hasn't yet. The girl. Gretta read the passage again, trying to understand. What girl? What decision? She flipped forward, looking for more information, but the entries returned to their sparse, coded style. Check the site, all quiet, weather holding, as if the moment of confession had been an aberration, quickly suppressed. She continued reading, the afternoon light fading outside the dirty window. The journal covered 5 years, from 1962 to 1967, and the pattern remained consistent, routine ranger work punctuated by cryptic references to the site and the promise. In the final entry, dated December 30th, 1967, her grandfather had written only one line. The others who know are aging. Perhaps it dies with us. That would be a mercy. The journal ended there. Gretta closed it and sat in the gathering darkness, her mind working through what she'd read. Her grandfather had been protecting something, a secret, something involving a girl, a site that needed watching, and other people who shared the knowledge. She thought about her mother's warnings, the sudden move when Gretta was 7. That would have been 1974, 7 years after this journal ended. Had something happened then? Had the secret threatened to surface? Outside, the first drops of rain hit the cabin roof. Gretta stood and moved to the window, wiping a clear spot in the grime. The sky had gone dark grey, heavy with weather. The trail back would be muddy within the hour, treacherous by evening. She'd planned to camp near the cabin, but now she reconsidered. The cabin itself was shelter, and she needed more time to search it, to understand what her grandfather had left behind. She unpacked her sleeping bag and spread it on the old bed frame after testing its stability. Then she lit the kerosene lamp. Surprisingly, it still had fuel, and continued her search of the cabin's interior. Under the bed, pushed far back against the wall, she found the first metal box. It was about the size of a toolbox, steel construction, with a combination lock securing the lid. She pulled it out, feeling the weight of it, something substantial inside. She tried the combination from the door chain, 3274. Nothing. She tried her grandfather's birth year, the dates from the journal entries, every number sequence she could think of. The lock didn't budge. Gretta sat back on her heels, frustrated. Whatever was in this box, her grandfather had wanted it secure. She considered trying to force it open, but dismissed the idea. If it was important enough to lock, it was important enough to open properly. She stood and examined the shelves more carefully, running her hands along the back edges, checking for hidden compartments. In the rafters above the bed, her fingers found something that wasn't wood, a smaller box, wedged between two beams. She pulled it down carefully. This one was wood, about the size of a shoebox, with a simple latch. No lock. She opened it at the table, the lamplight casting shadows across the contents. Photographs. Dozens of them, black and white and fading to sepia. She lifted them out one by one, studying each carefully. Her grandfather as a younger man, maybe in his 40s, standing in forest settings. Always alone. Always with the same serious expression, as if the camera had caught him in the middle of difficult thoughts. In several photos he wore his ranger uniform. In others, just work clothes, flannel and denim, sturdy boots. One photograph was different. It showed her grandfather standing in a small clearing, surrounded by stones arranged in a rough circle. They weren't natural. Someone had placed them deliberately, creating a border around a patch of ground. It looked almost like a grave, though there was no marker, no indication of who might be buried there. Gretta turned the photograph over. On the back, in her grandfather's handwriting, "Forgive me." She set it down carefully and picked up the next photo. This one showed a closer view of the stone circle, and she could see now that the ground inside was slightly sunken, as if the earth had settled over time. Definitely a grave, or something that had been buried and marked. Her hands were shaking slightly. She set the photos down and stood, needing to move, to process what she was seeing. Her grandfather had kept watch over a burial site. A girl had died. He'd written about a promise, about keeping a secret, about hoping it would die with those who knew. The implications were clear and terrible. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming hard against the roof. Gretta walked to the door and opened it, standing in the threshold and looking out at the darkening forest. The rain was cold, already turning the clearing to mud. The trail would be impassable by now. She couldn't leave even if she wanted to. She was trapped here for the night, alone with her grandfather's secrets and the growing certainty that she'd inherited more than just a cabin. She closed the door and returned to the table. The journal sat where she'd left it, next to the photographs. She opened it again, this time reading more carefully, looking for any detail she might have missed. In a March 1963 entry, she found a single word that made her stop. Stella. March 12th, 1963. Snow melting early this year. Checked the site. Runoff is significant. Reinforced the stones. Stella would be 19 now. I think of her mother sometimes, how she must wonder. The not knowing is its own kind of death. Stella. The girl had a name. Gretta closed the journal and stood again, her mind racing. She needed to search the cabin more thoroughly. If there was one locked box, there might be others. If there was one journal, there might be more. Her grandfather had left her this place for a reason, and she was beginning to understand that it wasn't just about property. It was about truth. The rain continued, steady and cold. The lamp flickered, casting moving shadows across the walls. Gretta pulled her jacket tighter and began a systematic search of every corner, every shelf, every possible hiding place in the small cabin. By the time full darkness fell outside, she'd found nothing more. Just the journal, the photographs, and the locked metal box that held secrets she couldn't yet access. She made a simple dinner from her pack, trail mix and jerky, water from her bottle, and sat at the table while the storm settled in around the cabin. Her grandfather had lived with this weight for years, decades. He'd come to this cabin, kept his vigil, maintained his silence. And now he'd passed it to her. The question was why. Did he want her to keep the secret, or expose it? Did he want absolution, or just a witness? Gretta lay down on her sleeping bag as the night deepened. The lamp turned low. Tomorrow, if the rain stopped, she would explore the area around the cabin. If there was a site to check, a grave to find, she needed to see it for herself. But tonight, alone in the locked cabin that had stood empty for 60 years, she could only listen to the rain and wonder what other secrets were buried in these mountains. Gretta woke to the sound of rain still falling, though lighter now, a steady patter instead of the previous night's deluge. Grey dawn light filtered through the dirty window. She'd slept poorly, her dreams full of stone circles and locked boxes, and a faceless girl named Stella. She made instant coffee using her camp stove, heating water in her metal cup, and sat at the table with the journal open in front of her. In the clearer morning light, she read through the entries again, this time making notes on a page torn from her own field notebook. Key points. The site needed checking. Multiple people knew the secret. A girl named Stella. A promise had been made. Her grandfather felt guilt but remained committed to silence. She returned to the photograph of the stone circle and studied it more carefully. The trees in the background were Douglas firs and western hemlocks, typical for this area. The understory vegetation looked similar to what grew around the cabin. The site was nearby. It had to be. But where? Gretta set the photograph down and picked up the journal again, flipping to the back pages. Sometimes people kept notes in the back of journals, she knew. Maps, lists, reminders. Her grandfather had been methodical about his ranger work. Maybe he'd been methodical about this too. The last few pages were blank, but when she held the journal up to the lamp, she noticed something. Faint indentations on the final page, as if something had been written on a page above it, and the pressure had left marks. She angled the journal different ways, trying to make out the words, but the impressions were too faint. She set it aside and returned to the contents of the wooden box. More photographs, all variations on the same themes. Her grandfather in the forest, the stone circle from different angles, a few shots of the cabin itself from decades ago when the wood was less weathered. At the bottom of the box, she found a folded piece of paper. It was a topographical map, the kind rangers used, showing elevation lines and terrain features. The map covered the area around the cabin, extending several miles in each direction. Her grandfather had marked it with pen, the cabin's location circled in red, and 3 other locations marked with red X's. Next to each X, he'd written something. The first, about 2 miles northwest of the cabin, was labeled 1959. The second, roughly 3 miles east, was labeled The Stand. The third, the farthest away at nearly 4 miles south, was simply labeled Route. Gretta studied the map closely. As a wilderness guide, she could read topography the way most people read street signs. The location marked 1959 was in a small valley, accessible by game trails. The Stand appeared to be in an area of old-growth forest, near a seasonal creek. Route was in the densest part of the forest, at a slightly higher elevation. She pulled out her own map and compared the two. She recognized all 3 locations. She'd been near them on various guiding trips over the years. Not close enough to notice anything unusual, but close enough to reach in a day's hike. The question was, which one matched the photograph of the stone circle? She studied the photo again, looking for identifying features. The trees were mature, but not ancient. The ground sloped slightly downward to the left of the frame. In the background, barely visible, was what might have been a large boulder or rock outcropping. Her best guess, the location marked 1959. The date matched the earliest references in the journal to checking the site, and the terrain matched what she could see in the photograph. Gretta made her decision. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. If she left now, she could reach the first location, investigate, and return to the cabin before dark. She'd leave most of her gear here, just take water, her GPS, her camera, and basic safety equipment. She packed quickly, then paused at the door. Something about leaving the cabin felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, but significant. As if by stepping out to find the site her grandfather had watched over, she was committing to something she couldn't undo. She thought about her mother, about the warnings to stay away from her grandfather. She thought about the life she'd built in isolation, asking no questions and offering no explanations. Safe, separate, alone. Then she thought about the photograph on the back of which her grandfather had written, "Forgive me," and she opened the door. The forest was quiet, except for the drip of rain from the branches. The clearing around the cabin looked different in daylight, smaller, more vulnerable. She could see where the trail continued past the cabin, faint but visible, leading deeper into the trees. Gretta checked her GPS, oriented herself to the map, and started walking northwest. The terrain was rough, all uphill at first, then dropping down into the valley her grandfather had marked. No trail here. She had to pick her way carefully through undergrowth and fallen timber. Her boots were soon soaked, her jacket beaded with moisture. But she'd hiked in worse conditions, and she moved steadily, checking her GPS every few minutes to stay on course. After an hour, the forest opened slightly. She was in the valley now, and ahead she could see a small clearing. Natural or man-made, she couldn't tell yet. She approached slowly, watching where she placed her feet. The clearing was maybe 30 feet across, hemmed in by mature trees, and in the center, just as in the photograph, was a circle of stones. Gretta stopped at the edge and stared. The stones were weathered, covered in moss and lichen, but they were definitely placed by human hands. They formed a rough oval about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. Inside the circle, the ground was slightly sunken, grass and ferns growing over whatever lay beneath. She walked around the perimeter slowly, taking photographs from different angles. The boulder she'd seen in the background of her grandfather's photo was here, about 20 feet to the north, a large granite outcropping, split down the middle by some ancient geological force. This was the place. The site her grandfather had checked for decades. The place where someone named Stella had ended up. Gretta knelt beside the stone circle, her throat tight. If this was a grave, and everything suggested it was, then Stella had died in 1959 or shortly before. She would have been young, based on her grandfather's comment that she would have been 19 in 1963. A teenager then. A girl who died in these mountains and been buried in secret, known only to a few people who'd made a promise to keep her hidden. But why? What had happened to her? And why would her grandfather, a ranger, a man sworn to protect and serve, participate in hiding her death? Gretta stood and walked the clearing more carefully, looking for anything else her grandfather might have left. Near the base of the boulder, partially hidden by ferns, she found something that made her breath catch. A piece of jewelry, tarnished silver, tangled in the roots of a young hemlock. She pulled it free carefully. A bracelet, delicate, with small charms attached. She wiped the dirt away and examined the charms in the grey morning light. A tiny book, a musical note, a heart. On the back of the heart, engraved in tiny script, S.M., Stella M. Her last name started with M. Gretta sat down heavily on a fallen log, the bracelet in her palm. This was real, not just her grandfather's guilt or cryptic journal entries, but actual evidence of a person who'd been here, who'd died here, who'd been buried and forgotten by everyone except a few aging men who'd chosen silence over truth. She took photographs of the bracelet from every angle, then carefully placed it in a plastic bag from her pack. Evidence. If this ever came to light, when it came to light, people would need proof. The rain had stopped completely now, and shafts of weak sunlight broke through the clouds. Gretta looked at the stone circle again and made a decision. She couldn't leave Stella here without acknowledging her. She stood, removed her hat, and spoke aloud to the clearing. "I don't know what happened to you. I don't know who you were or why they buried you here. But I'm going to find out. And I'm going to make sure people know. You won't be forgotten anymore." Her voice sounded strange in the forest quiet, but she felt better for speaking. She put her hat back on, checked her GPS, and began the hike back to the cabin. She had 2 more locations to investigate, a locked box to open, and a mystery that was starting to take shape in her mind. Her grandfather hadn't just kept a secret. He'd kept watch over someone who'd been erased from memory. And now, somehow, it was Gretta's responsibility to bring the truth back into the light. By the time Gretta returned to the cabin, it was early afternoon. She was exhausted, wet and shaking, not from cold, but from the weight of what she'd found. She built a fire in the wood stove using dry kindling from a stack she'd found under a tarp on the porch and sat close to it while her clothes steamed. The bracelet sat on the table in its plastic bag, the charms catching the firelight. SM. A girl who'd loved books and music. A girl who'd worn a heart charm with her initials. A girl who'd died young and been hidden away. Gretta pulled out her phone. No signal this deep in the mountains, but she'd downloaded offline maps and information before leaving home. She opened her notes app and began typing everything she knew, creating a timeline, a record of facts that couldn't be disputed later. 1959. Stella M. dies or disappears, buried at location marked on grandfather's map. 1962. Grandfather begins journal entries about the site and the promise. 1967. Final journal entry mentions the others who know and hoping the secret dies with them. 1974. Gretta's family moves suddenly. Her mother cuts all contact with grandfather. Present. Gretta inherits cabin and discovers the truth. She stared at the timeline. There were gaps, huge gaps, in the story. Who was Stella? How did she die? Who else was involved in the cover-up? And what happened in 1967 that made her grandfather stop writing in the journal? She needed more information. The locked metal box under the bed, whatever was inside, might provide answers. But without the combination, it was useless. Gretta stood and paced the small cabin, thinking. Her grandfather had been methodical. He'd left her the cabin, left her the journal, left her the map. He'd wanted her to find these things, which meant he probably wanted her to open the box, too. The combination would be something she could figure out, something meaningful. She tried dates from the journal again. 1/15/62 for the first entry, 12/30/67 for the last. Nothing worked. She tried 1959, the date from the map. Still nothing. Then she remembered the bracelet. SMM. What if her grandfather had used Stella's information for the combination? But she didn't know Stella's last name, didn't know her birthday, didn't know anything except those 2 initials and the year she died. Gretta returned to the wooden box and searched through the photographs again, looking for anything she might have missed. At the very bottom, beneath all the photos, she found a folded piece of newspaper. She unfolded it carefully. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age, but the text was still legible. The Skagit Valley Herald, August 1959. The headline read, "Search continues for missing girl." Gretta's hands trembled as she read. The search for Stella Marsh, 16 of Concrete, entered its 5th day Monday with no sign of the missing teenager. Stella was last seen on July 15th during a family camping trip near Cascade Pass. She told her parents she was going for a short hike and never returned. Search and rescue teams, including Forest Service rangers and volunteer groups, have covered more than 50 square miles of terrain without finding any trace of the girl. "We're not giving up," said Sheriff Tom Bradshaw. "These mountains can be unforgiving, but we owe it to the Marsh family to bring their daughter home." Stella is described as 5'4", approximately 110 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes. She was last seen wearing blue jeans, a white t-shirt, and hiking boots. Anyone with information is urged to contact the Skagit County Sheriff's Office. Below the article was a photograph, a school picture of a young girl with a shy smile and kind eyes, Stella Marsh. The caption read, "Stella Marsh, missing since July 15th. Gretta set the newspaper down and closed her eyes. Stella Marsh, 16 years old, disappeared on July 15th, 1959. Never found, at least not officially, but her grandfather had known where she was, had been there, maybe, had helped hide her body, or at least had hidden the truth of what happened to her. She picked up the locked box and tried a new combination, 07 15 43. July 15th, 1943. Stella's likely birth date, if she was 16 in 1959. The lock clicked open. Gretta lifted the lid slowly. Inside was another journal, thicker than the first, and beneath it a stack of cash, old bills, probably several $1,000s, and at the bottom a sealed envelope with writing on the front, "To whoever finds this." She set aside the money and the envelope and picked up the journal. This one was dated 1968, 1985, picking up where the first had left off. She opened to the first page and began to read. January 1st, 1968. Starting a new journal because the old one is full and because I need to write this down, even if no one ever reads it. I need to explain what I did and why, even though there's no explanation that makes it right. Stella Marsh didn't die in an accident. She was killed. And I helped hide her body to protect someone who didn't deserve protection. I've told myself for 8 years that I did it for good reasons, to protect a family, to prevent more pain. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I was a coward. I chose loyalty over justice, and I've been living with that choice every day since. Gretta's chest tightened. She continued reading, her grandfather's confession unfolding across the pages. The boy was 17, the son of my best friend. He and Stella had been close. I don't know all the details of what happened that day, but I know he was with her when she fell, or was pushed. Even now, I don't know which. He came to me in a panic, said there'd been an accident, said she was dead. I should have called it in right then. Should have let the law handle it. But he was crying, terrified, and his father, my friend, begged me to help them. Said the boy had a future, that this would destroy the entire family. They promised to send him away, get him help, make sure nothing like this ever happened again. I believed them. God help me, I believed them. We buried Stella in the valley where she'd fallen, made it look like natural terrain. The official story was that she'd gotten lost and died of exposure somewhere in the back country. After a few weeks, the search was called off. Her family had a funeral with an empty casket, and the boy went away to military school back east. For a while, I told myself we'd done the right thing. Stella was dead. Nothing could change that. The boy was getting help. The family was being spared the publicity of a trial, the shame of a conviction. But then I started thinking about Stella's mother, about how she'd never know what happened to her daughter, about how she'd spend the rest of her life wondering, and I understood that what we'd done wasn't mercy, it was cruelty. Gretta had to stop reading. She stood and walked to the window, her vision blurred. Her grandfather had been part of a cover-up, had helped hide a teenager's death, possibly a murder, to protect the son of a friend. The enormity of it was staggering, but he'd felt guilt. That much was clear. He'd kept watch over Stella's grave for decades, making sure no one disturbed it, making sure she wasn't forgotten entirely. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. She returned to the journal and continued reading. The entries covered years of her grandfather's vigil, his growing isolation as he withdrew from friends and family, unable to live with the secret, but unwilling to expose it. In a 1974 entry, she found a reference to her mother. "My daughter knows something is wrong. She's been asking questions about why I spend so much time in the mountains, why I won't talk about my work. Yesterday she found a photograph, one of the ones I took of Stella's resting place. I made an excuse, but I could see she didn't believe me. I'm afraid she'll keep digging. I'm afraid she'll find the truth, and it will destroy her like it's destroying me. I have to protect her from this, even if it means losing her." So that was why they'd moved. Her mother had gotten too close to the truth, and her grandfather had pushed them away to keep her safe from the knowledge. Gretta wiped her eyes and kept reading. The later entries mentioned the other people who'd known. The boy's father, a local doctor who'd helped with the burial, a sheriff who'd been paid to stop the investigation. All of them older, all of them eventually dying. By 1985, her grandfather wrote, "I'm the last one left who knows where Stella is buried. The boy, a man now, successful by all accounts, has built a life far from here. Maybe he thinks about what he did. Maybe he doesn't. I don't know, and I can't ask. I just keep my promise to check the site, to make sure she rests undisturbed. It's all I can do for her now." The journal ended there. 17 years before the first journal had started, Gretta realized her grandfather must have kept other journals in between, covering the years from 1985 to 1962 that were missing. Or maybe he'd stopped writing for a while, unable to continue facing his guilt on paper. She closed the journal and sat in silence, the fire crackling in the stove. Outside, the sun was setting, the light going orange, then grey. She needed to make a decision. She could take what she'd found and go to the authorities. Stella Marsh's family might still have relatives who deserved to know the truth. Justice might still be possible, even after all these years. But there were complications. Her grandfather had been dead for weeks. The boy, now a man in his 70s, had built a life. The others involved were all dead. What would exposing the truth accomplish besides pain? Gretta stood and walked to the door, opening it to the evening air. The forest was quiet, peaceful. It had kept this secret for decades. Maybe it was meant to stay secret. But then she thought of Stella Marsh's mother, who'd died never knowing what happened to her daughter. She thought of a 16-year-old girl buried in an unmarked grave, her life cut short and then erased from memory. She thought of her own mother, damaged by secrets she'd sensed but never fully understood. No, silence hadn't served anyone. It had just preserved the comfort of the guilty and denied peace to the innocent. Gretta made her decision. She would find out everything. She would visit the other 2 locations on the map. She would document every piece of evidence. And then she would decide what to do with the truth her grandfather had left her. But first, she needed to read what was in the sealed envelope. Gretta didn't open the envelope that night. She told herself she was too tired, that she needed rest before processing anything more. But the truth was, she was afraid. Whatever her grandfather had written to whoever finds this would change things, would force her to act in ways she couldn't yet predict. She slept fitfully again, waking several times to the sounds of the forest settling around the cabin. Each time she stared at the envelope on the table, white in the darkness, waiting. Morning came cold and clear. Gretta made coffee and oatmeal, forcing herself to eat even though she had no appetite. Then she sat at the table, picked up the envelope, and carefully tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in her grandfather's handwriting. The letter was dated 3 weeks before his death. To whoever finds this, I'm writing this in the hospital, where they tell me I have maybe a month left. Cancer. At my age, it's not unexpected. But it means I'm running out of time to do what I should have done 60 years ago. Tell the truth. If you're reading this, you've found the journals. You've probably found the map. Maybe you've even found Stella's grave. I don't know who you are. Maybe a stranger who bought the cabin at auction. Maybe family. But whoever you are, you deserve to know the whole story. Stella Marsh wasn't the only one. In 1962, 3 years after Stella died, there was another girl, Lily Kowalski, 14 years old. She disappeared during a camping trip with friends. The same circumstances, the same location, more or less. And the same boy, now a young man, was responsible. But this time there was a witness, another girl who was with them, who saw what happened and ran. The boy and his father came to me again, desperate. They said it had been an accident, that the boy had problems, that they were getting him help. They begged me to help hide Lily's body like I'd helped with Stella. I refused at first. I said I'd go to the police, that I should have gone years ago. But then the father told me who the witness was. My own daughter. She was 17. She'd been on that camping trip. She'd seen the boy kill Lily and had escaped. And if I went to the police, if I told the truth about Stella and Lily, my daughter would have to testify, and the family would make sure she was blamed somehow, or worse. They had the money and power to do terrible things. So I made the same choice again. I helped hide Lily's body at the place marked on the map as the stand. I made my daughter promise never to speak of what she'd seen, and I moved our family away from the area so she'd be safe from that family's influence. I destroyed my daughter's life to protect it. She never recovered from keeping that secret, and I never forgave myself for asking her to keep it. The boy's name is Marcus Driscoll. His father was Owen Driscoll, who owned half the timber operations in the county. They're both alive now. Marcus is in his 70s, Owen in his 90s, if he's still breathing. Marcus became a businessman, respectable by all accounts. He has children, grandchildren, a good reputation, and 2 girls are buried in these mountains, forgotten by everyone except me. I don't know what you should do with this information. The law might not care after all this time. Statute of limitations, lack of evidence, the fact that everyone involved is old or dead. But the families of those girls deserved to know. They deserved to bury their daughters properly and understand what happened. I failed them. Maybe you won't. The 3rd location on the map, Route, is where I tried to do one thing right. You'll understand when you find it. I'm sorry for passing this burden to you, but I'm also grateful. I've carried it alone for so long. Samuel Lowen. Gretta set the letter down with shaking hands. Her mother. Her mother had witnessed a murder, had been threatened, had been forced to keep silent to protect herself. Everything about her mother's anxiety, her fear, her warnings about staying away from her grandfather, all of it made terrible sense now. And there had been 2 victims, not one. Lily Kowalski, another family that had spent decades not knowing. Gretta stood and paced the cabin, her mind reeling. Marcus Driscoll. The name meant nothing to her, but if he was from a wealthy timber family, there would be records, information. She could find him, could confirm he was real, that all of this was true. But what would she do then? Confront an old man with accusations from 60 years ago? Go to the police with nothing but journals and buried bodies? Her grandfather was right. The law might not care. But the truth mattered. Justice mattered. Even delayed justice. She pulled out her phone and checked her downloaded files. No cellular signal here, but she'd downloaded regional history and business information before leaving civilization. She searched for Driscoll Timber, Skagit County. Several results appeared. Driscoll Timber Company, founded 1923, one of the largest operators in the region through the 1980s, sold to a multinational corporation in 1987. Owen Driscoll, CEO until retirement in 1985. Marcus Driscoll served as company president from 1975-1987, then moved into private investment and philanthropy. A photograph from a 1980 business profile showed Marcus Driscoll at age 50, distinguished-looking, silver-haired, expensive suit. The caption noted his charitable work and community leadership. Nothing about dead girls in the mountains. Gretta felt sick. This man had killed 2 teenagers and lived a comfortable, honored life. Had probably never faced consequences beyond whatever private guilt he might have felt, if he felt any at all. She had to see the other sites, had to find Lily's grave and the 3rd location her grandfather had mentioned. Then she had to decide what to do with all of it. She packed quickly, taking only essentials. The 2nd location, the stand, was 3 miles east, accessible but challenging terrain. If she left now, she could reach it by early afternoon, investigate, and return before dark. The hike was harder than the first. The terrain rose sharply, crossing several ridgelines before dropping into a narrow valley with a seasonal creek. Gretta's GPS guided her, but the undergrowth was thick, and several times she had to detour around impassable tangles of brush and deadfall. After 2 hours, she reached the area her grandfather had marked. The stand referred to a grove of old-growth cedars, their massive trunks rising like pillars. The forest floor was relatively clear here, shaded by the dense canopy above, and in a small clearing between the largest trees, she found another stone cairn. This one was better maintained than Stella's. The stones were arranged more carefully, and someone had cleared the vegetation recently, within the past year, Gretta guessed. Her grandfather, making his final visits before he became too ill. She knelt beside the cairn and felt tears sting her eyes. Lily Kowalski, 14 years old, dead for over 60 years, hidden away to protect a murderer. She wondered if anyone still remembered Lily, if her family had given up hope, held a funeral, tried to move on, or if somewhere an elderly sibling still wondered what happened that day in the mountains. Gretta photographed everything from multiple angles, documenting the location with her GPS. Unlike Stella's grave, she found no personal items here, no bracelet, no evidence beyond the stones themselves. Maybe Lily's belongings had been removed by Marcus or his father. Maybe they'd simply been lost to time and weather. She sat on a fallen log and pulled out her water bottle, drinking slowly while she thought. 2 graves, 2 victims, 1 man responsible. Her grandfather complicit in both cover-ups, though the second time he'd been coerced by threats against his daughter. The complexity of it was overwhelming. Her grandfather wasn't purely guilty or purely innocent. He'd made terrible choices, but some had been made under duress. He'd kept silent, but had also kept watch, making sure the girls weren't completely forgotten. He'd lived with guilt, but hadn't had the courage to expose the truth while alive. And now it was Gretta's choice, her burden, her responsibility. She stood and prepared for the hike back to the cabin. Tomorrow she would visit the third location, Route. Her grandfather had said she'd understand when she found it, that it was where he'd tried to do something right. She needed to see it, needed the complete picture before she decided what came next. The hike back was faster, her body remembering the route. She reached the cabin as the sun was setting, her muscles aching but her mind clear. She built another fire, heated a simple dinner, and sat at the table with the journals and the letter spread in front of her. Marcus Driscoll had escaped justice for over 60 years. He was old now, probably thought he'd gotten away with it completely. Probably slept well at night, his conscience clear, or at least quieted by time and distance. Gretta made a decision. Whatever she found at the third location, whatever her grandfather had left there, she would take all of it to the authorities. She would contact Stella's and Lily's families, if any relatives still lived. She would make sure the truth came out, regardless of how much time had passed. 2 girls deserved to be remembered. 2 families deserved closure. And 1 man deserved to face what he'd done, even if consequences came 60 years late. She just hoped she had the strength to see it through. The third day at the cabin dawned cold and bright. Gretta woke with purpose, her decision made. She would visit Route, gather whatever evidence her grandfather had left there, and then hike out. It was time to leave the mountains and enter the complicated world of police reports, family notifications, and whatever legal consequences might still exist for a 70-something-year-old murderer. But first, she needed to see what her grandfather meant by trying to do something right. The hike to Route was the longest yet, 4 miles south through increasingly dense forest. The terrain was challenging, all uphill, and Gretta had to stop frequently to check her GPS and make sure she hadn't drifted off course. No trails here. This was true back country, the kind of forest that could swallow a person if they didn't know what they were doing. After 3 hours of steady climbing, she reached a plateau thick with old-growth timber. The trees here were enormous, cedars and Douglas firs that had stood for centuries, their trunks wider than she could wrap her arms around. The forest floor was carpeted with moss and ferns, and the air smelled of earth and decay and ancient wood. She checked her GPS. She was close, maybe 100 yards from the marked location. She moved slowly now, scanning the forest for anything unusual. And then she saw it, a massive cedar, larger than any of the others, its trunk twisted and gnarled with age. At the base, clearly visible even from a distance, were carvings in the bark. Gretta approached carefully, her heart pounding. The carvings were old, weathered, but still legible. At eye level, someone had carved 2 sets of initials and dates. SM 1959, LK 1962, a memorial. Her grandfather had created a memorial for the girls where anyone who found it would know they'd existed, would know they'd died. Below the initials, carved in the same careful script, "Forgive us. Forgive me." Gretta pressed her hand against the bark, feeling the rough channels her grandfather had cut decades ago. This was what he'd meant by trying to do something right. He couldn't give the girls justice, couldn't even give them proper graves with their names. But he could mark their existence, could leave evidence that someone had cared. She photographed the carvings from every angle, then walked around the base of the enormous tree. On the backside, hidden from casual view, was a hollow in the trunk, a natural cavity that someone had enlarged and fitted with a wooden cover. Gretta removed the cover carefully. Inside was a metal box, similar to the one under the cabin's bed, but smaller. This one wasn't locked. She pulled it out and sat with it on the mossy ground. Inside the box, legal documents, copies of police reports or attempts at police reports. The first was dated August 1959, signed by her grandfather and submitted to the Skagit County Sheriff's Office. It detailed finding evidence of Stella Marsh's death, provided a location, and requested investigation. Stamped across the top in red ink, "Unfounded, no evidence." The second report, dated July 1962, described witnessing the discovery of Lily Kowalski's body and named Marcus Driscoll as responsible. This one was stamped. "Insufficient evidence. Case closed." There were 3 more attempts, each filed to different agencies: state police, county prosecutor, even the FBI. All of them stamped with variations of the same message: no evidence, insufficient grounds, case closed. At the bottom of the box, Gretta found letters. Correspondence between her grandfather and a lawyer named Theodore Klein, dated 1963. Klein had written, "Mr. Lowen, I understand your concerns, but I must advise you to cease these allegations immediately. The Driscoll family has retained counsel and will pursue defamation charges if you continue. You have no physical evidence, no witnesses willing to testify, and no legal standing. Furthermore, your own involvement in the alleged cover-up exposes you to criminal liability. I strongly suggest you let this matter rest." Her grandfather's response, in his careful handwriting: "I understand the risks, but those girls deserve justice. Their families deserve the truth. I will continue to pursue this through every legal channel available until someone listens." But no one had listened, or more accurately, people with power had made sure no one listened. The Driscoll family's money and influence had shut down every investigation before it started. They'd threatened her grandfather with prosecution for his own involvement, effectively silencing him. And without physical evidence or witnesses, with her mother too terrified to speak, there was nothing he could do. So he'd created this archive, proof that he'd tried. Documentation of the institutional failure, the corruption, the way wealth had purchased silence. He'd hidden it here at the tree he'd marked as a memorial, hoping that someday someone would find it and succeed where he'd failed. Gretta sat surrounded by evidence of her grandfather's attempts to seek justice and the system's failure to provide it. She felt a strange mixture of emotions: anger at the corruption, sadness for her grandfather's defeat, but also respect. He'd tried, against impossible odds, facing threats to himself and his family. He'd tried to do the right thing. She packed everything carefully into her backpack: the documents, the photographs, the GPS coordinates of all 3 sites. She had everything now. The complete story of what had happened to Stella Marsh and Lily Kowalski, the cover-up, her grandfather's complicity and his attempts at redemption, and the name of the man responsible for it all: Marcus Driscoll. If he was still alive, and her research suggested he was, he would be around 74 years old. Living comfortably in Seattle, according to the information she'd found, surrounded by family and friends who thought him a successful businessman and philanthropist. A man who'd gotten away with murder twice. The question was whether anything could be done about it now. 60-plus years had passed. Physical evidence would be degraded. Witnesses were dead or, in her mother's case, traumatized and possibly unwilling to speak. Legal statutes of limitations might apply, though Gretta wasn't sure if there was a limitation on murder. But even if criminal prosecution wasn't possible, there were other forms of justice: public exposure. the ruin of a carefully constructed reputation, the knowledge, for Stella's and Lily's families, of what had really happened. Those things might not be perfect justice, but they were something. Gretta stood and took one last look at the memorial tree. The carvings would last for decades more, maybe centuries if the tree survived. SM and LK, two girls who'd deserved long lives and had been given only brief, tragic deaths and unmarked graves. "I'll make sure people know," she said aloud. "I'll make sure you're not forgotten." The forest was quiet, but she felt heard, felt the weight of the promise settling onto her shoulders alongside all the others she'd accumulated over the past 3 days. The hike back to the cabin took most of the afternoon. By the time she arrived, the sun was low and the air had turned cold. She built a fire one last time and sorted through everything she'd gathered. 3 days ago, she'd come here expecting nothing but a decaying building and maybe some insight into why her grandfather had pushed her family away. Instead, she'd found murder and cover-up, corruption and institutional failure, and a burden of truth that now rested entirely with her. She thought about calling her mother, asking her directly about what she'd witnessed, about the years of fear and silence. But that conversation needed to happen in person, face to face. It would be difficult, maybe the most difficult conversation of Gretta's life. But it was necessary. Tomorrow she would hike out. The trail should be passable by now, the mud dried enough to allow safe travel. She would load everything into her pack, journals, documents, photographs, even the bracelet she'd found at Stella's grave. She would drive straight to the state police headquarters in Everett, avoiding the local sheriff's office that had failed her grandfather decades ago. And then she would let the process unfold. Whatever came next, investigation, media attention, family notifications, confrontation with Marcus Driscoll, she would face it. Not because she wanted to, but because it was right. Because 2 girls deserved to be remembered, and 1 man deserved to face what he'd done. Her grandfather had chosen fear over courage, loyalty over justice. He'd paid for those choices with decades of guilt and isolation. Gretta wouldn't make the same mistakes. She would be braver than he'd been. She would tell the truth, no matter the cost. She lay down in her sleeping bag for the last time, the cabin creaking around her in the wind. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow she would step out of this place and into a future she couldn't predict. But tonight, she slept better than she had since arriving. The weight was still there, but it felt different now. Not crushing, but purposeful. She knew what she had to do, and she knew she would do it. Gretta woke before dawn, packed methodically, and prepared to leave. She'd cleaned the cabin, restored it as much as possible to how she'd found it, minus the metal boxes and their contents, which were now secure in her backpack. She stood in the doorway one last time, looking at the space that had been sealed for 60 years, holding its secrets. Then she remembered the envelope, the one her grandfather had sealed, addressed to "Whoever finds this." She'd read his letter, but she hadn't examined the envelope itself closely. Something about it nagged at her. She pulled it from her pack and studied it in the early light. The envelope was thick, thicker than a single sheet of paper should make it. She turned it over and saw what she'd missed before, a second sealed compartment, a hidden pocket created by folding and gluing an additional layer of paper. Her hands trembled as she carefully tore it open. Inside was another letter, this one addressed specifically to her. "Gretta, if you're reading this, you found everything. The journals, the maps, the graves. You know about Stella and Lily. You know what I did and what I failed to do. But there's more. Something I couldn't write in the other letter because I needed you to see the rest first, to understand the context before I told you this final truth. The witness I mentioned, the girl who saw Marcus kill Lily, was your mother. You've probably figured that out by now. What you don't know is that she tried to report it. She went to me first, terrified, and begged me to help her go to the police. She wanted to do the right thing. I was the one who stopped her. I convinced her that testifying would put her in danger, that the Driscoll family would retaliate, that the best thing was silence and distance. I told her it was to protect her, but the truth was more complicated. I was protecting myself too. If she testified, my role in covering up Stella's death would come out. I'd face prosecution, possibly prison. So I sacrificed my daughter's peace of mind to save myself. I moved the family away, made her promise never to speak of it, and watched her suffer for decades under the weight of that secret. Your mother is the key to justice now. She's the only living witness to what Marcus did. But I don't know if she'll speak. The fear and trauma run deep. She may refuse. And I can't ask her. I'll be gone by the time you read this. That's why I left this to you. Not just the cabin and the evidence, but the choice. You can take what you found to the authorities, but without your mother's testimony, it's just the word of a dead man and some old documents. It might not be enough. You'll have to ask her. You'll have to reopen wounds that have never healed. And I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for all of it. But there's one more thing you need to know, and it's the hardest truth of all. Marcus Driscoll didn't stop at 2. In 1965, 3 years after Lily, there was another disappearance. A girl named Karen Price, 15, vanished during a school camping trip. I wasn't directly involved that time. I'd already moved my family away. But I heard about it. And I knew. The location, the circumstances, the family's sudden donation to the search fund, it all pointed to the same pattern. I hiked back up into these mountains on my own and searched. It took me 2 weeks, but I found her, or found where she'd been buried. The Driscolls had learned from the previous mistakes. This grave was better hidden, deeper in the back country. I tried to report it, used every legal channel I'd exhausted before. But by then I had no credibility. I was the ranger who'd made false accusations about a respected family. No one would listen. So I marked the location on a map and added it to the archive at Route. I couldn't save her. Couldn't even get her a proper burial. All I could do was make sure someone, someday, would know. 3 girls, Gretta. 3 families that never got closure. And 1 man who kept killing because no one stopped him. I don't know if he killed more. I left the area in 1967, retired early, and tried to disappear from the guilt. Maybe he stopped. Maybe the pattern ended. Or maybe there are other graves I never found. This is what I'm giving you. The burden of knowing. The responsibility of deciding what to do with that knowledge. I failed these girls. I failed my daughter. I failed myself. Don't fail them the way I did. You were always brave, even as a child. You asked hard questions. You didn't accept easy answers. That's why you left. You couldn't stand your mother's silence or my distance. You needed truth, even when it hurt. Use that courage now. Find your mother. Ask her to speak. And if she can't or won't, then you speak for all of them. For Stella, for Lily, for Karen, for every girl Marcus Driscoll hurt, and for every girl he might have hurt if someone had stopped him sooner. I know this is unfair. You didn't ask for this burden. But you're the only one who can carry it now. The only one who can give these girls what they deserved. Acknowledgement, justice, peace. I love you. I always did, even through the distance and the silence. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to do this myself. Be stronger than me. The map at route includes the location where I believe Karen is buried. The coordinates are marked in pencil on the back. I never told anyone else about her. You're the first. Forgive me, if you can. But more importantly, finish what I couldn't. Grandpa. Gretta sat down hard on the cabin floor, the letter shaking in her hands. 3 victims, not 2. 3 girls dead and buried in secret, and possibly more that her grandfather never found. Karen Price. She pulled out her phone and searched her downloaded files. There, a brief article from the Everett Herald, September 1965. Karen Price, 15, disappeared during a camping trip. Search called off after 2 weeks. No trace ever found. The article mentioned a generous donation from Driscoll Timber Company to the search fund and ongoing investigation. Blood money. A donation to make them look concerned, civic-minded. Meanwhile, they'd helped hide another body. Gretta felt rage building in her chest, hot and clean. Marcus Driscoll hadn't just killed twice in a panic or moment of violence. He'd killed at least 3 times over 6 years. He was a serial killer, protected by wealth and family influence, and he'd gotten away with it because people like her grandfather had been too afraid or too compromised to stop him. She looked at the back of the map her grandfather had mentioned. There, in faint pencil, was a 4th location, unmarked on the main map, but clearly noted on the reverse with coordinates and a date, 1965. 4 locations now, 3 graves confirmed, 1 suspected, and a man who'd lived 74 years, most of them free from any consequences. Gretta stood and repacked everything, including the new letter. Her decision was made, but now it was bigger than she'd imagined. This wasn't just about 2 girls and a cover-up. This was about a serial predator who'd been allowed to hunt because the systems meant to protect people had failed completely. She had to find her mother, had to ask her to speak, to testify, to relive the worst day of her life for the sake of justice. And she had to visit that 4th location, confirm whether Karen Price was really buried there. Then she would take everything, every piece of evidence, every document, every GPS coordinate to the authorities. Not local police, but state investigators. Maybe federal authorities. She'd go as high as necessary until someone listened. And she would contact the families, Stella Marsh's relatives, Lily Kowalski's siblings, Karen Price's parents, if they were still alive. They deserved to know, deserved to finally bury their daughters properly and understand what had happened. The weight of it was enormous. But Gretta felt something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Clear, undeniable purpose. Her grandfather had failed, but she wouldn't. She had the evidence, the courage, and nothing to lose. No family to protect, no career to risk, no reputation to maintain. She was 58 years old, living alone in the mountains, and no one would miss her if she disappeared into this fight. But they wouldn't make her disappear. She'd make sure of that. She'd document everything, leave copies with attorneys, create a paper trail that couldn't be erased. Marcus Driscoll had gotten away with murder for over 60 years. But his time was up. Even if he never faced criminal prosecution, even if he never spent a day in prison, she would make sure the world knew what he was. Would make sure his name became synonymous with the girls he'd killed and the system that had protected him. Gretta locked the cabin door and started down the trail. The morning was cold and bright, the forest quiet except for the sound of her boots on the path. She didn't look back. The cabin had served its purpose, had held her grandfather's secrets until someone brave enough to face them finally arrived. Now those secrets were hers, and she would make sure they destroyed the man who'd created them. The hike down from the cabin took 3 hours. By the time Gretta reached her truck, her legs were shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. She loaded her pack carefully, making sure the documents and evidence were secure, then sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. She needed a plan. Rushing forward without strategy would waste everything her grandfather had preserved. She pulled out her notebook and began writing, organizing her thoughts into concrete steps. First, visit the 4th location and confirm Karen Price's burial site. She needed complete documentation before approaching authorities. Second, contact her mother. This would be the hardest part, but it was essential. Without her mother's testimony, the case against Marcus Driscoll might not hold. Third, compile everything into a comprehensive report with GPS coordinates, photographs, copies of all documents, and a clear timeline. Fourth, take everything to the Washington State Police, specifically their cold case division. She'd researched them years ago when considering volunteer work. They had a reputation for thoroughness and independence from local politics. Fifth, contact victims' families, but only after law enforcement was involved. She couldn't risk tipping off Marcus Driscoll or his family before authorities had secured the evidence. The plan was solid, but it would take time. At least a week, maybe 2. She started the truck and began the long drive back to civilization, her mind already working through the details. She stopped at a library in Marble Mount and used their computers to research more thoroughly. Marcus Driscoll had indeed built a respectable life. His Wikipedia page described him as a businessman and philanthropist who'd served on numerous charitable boards. There were photographs from fundraisers and community events. An older man with silver hair and an easy smile, always surrounded by family or colleagues. The photos made her sick. How many people had shaken his hand, praised his generosity, never knowing what he'd done in his youth. How many times had he looked at his own children or grandchildren and thought about the girls he'd killed. She found obituaries for Owen Driscoll, Marcus's father, who died in 2003 at age 91. The obituary described him as a pillar of the community and devoted family man. No mention of bribery, corruption, or covering up his son's crimes. Gretta printed everything she could find and added it to her growing file. Then she called the one person she knew who worked in law enforcement, a former client named Tom Brennan, who'd retired from the Seattle Police Department. "Tom, it's Gretta Lowen. I guided your group up Cascade Pass last summer." "Gretta, good to hear from you. What can I do for you?" "I need advice. Hypothetically, if someone found evidence of old murders, we're talking 60+ years old, how would they go about reporting that?" There was a pause. "That's pretty specific for a hypothetical question." "It's important, Tom." Another pause, longer this time. "Okay. Hypothetically, they'd want to go to the State Police Cold Case Unit. Local departments can be territorial or compromised, especially with old cases. State police have the resources and authority to investigate across jurisdictions. They'd need solid evidence, though. Bodies, documentation, credible witnesses. Without that, it's just accusations. What about statute of limitations? Murder? There is none in Washington. You can prosecute murder, no matter how long ago it happened, if you have the evidence, and the suspect is still alive. Gretta felt her heart rate increase. And if the suspect is wealthy, connected, has a good reputation, makes it harder but not impossible, especially these days with DNA evidence and modern forensics. Even old cases can be solved with the right techniques. Why are you asking, Gretta? She hesitated, then decided on partial honesty. I found something in my grandfather's belongings. I'm trying to figure out what to do with it. Found something or found someone? Both, potentially. Tom was quiet for a moment. You need to be careful. If this is real, if there are actually bodies and a living suspect, this is going to get complicated fast. Powerful people don't like old secrets coming to light. You should talk to a lawyer before you do anything. I will. Thanks, Tom. Gretta, seriously, be careful. Whatever this is, make sure you're protected first. She hung up and sat in her truck in the library parking lot, thinking about Tom's warning. He was right. If she went after Marcus Driscoll, his family would push back hard. They'd hire expensive lawyers, attack her credibility, maybe even threaten her the way they'd threatened her grandfather. She needed protection, documentation that couldn't be destroyed or suppressed. She needed to make sure that if anything happened to her, the truth would still come out. She drove to a FedEx office and made multiple copies of everything: journals, letters, photographs, maps, her own notes, and timeline. She sealed one set in an envelope addressed to Tom Brennan with instructions not to open unless something happened to her. Another set went to her attorney with similar instructions. A third set she mailed to herself at a friend's address in Oregon. Only then did she allow herself to feel slightly safer. The truth had too many copies now. It couldn't be contained. Next came the hardest part: calling her mother. They hadn't spoken in over 3 years. The distance between them had grown so wide that neither knew how to bridge it anymore. But this couldn't wait. Gretta sat in her truck and dialed the number she'd saved in her phone, but never called. 3 rings. 4. Then her mother's voice, cautious and surprised. "Gretta?" "Hi, Mum." A long silence. "Is everything all right?" "Not really. I need to talk to you, in person. It's about Grandpa." Another silence, heavier this time. "He died. I got the notice from his attorney." "I know. I inherited his cabin. I've been there. I found—" She stopped, not wanting to do this over the phone. "Mum, I found things. Things about what happened when you were 17, about why we moved, about everything." She heard her mother's breathing change, quick and shallow. "Gretta, don't—" "I know about Lily Kowalski. I know about Marcus Driscoll. I know you witnessed what he did." A sound that might have been a sob or a gasp. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand, please. I'm driving to Olympia tonight. Can I see you tomorrow?" "Gretta, this isn't— You need to leave this alone. You don't know what they're capable of." "Mum." Gretta kept her voice gentle but firm. "It's been 60 years. Grandpa spent his whole life keeping silent to protect you, and it destroyed him. It destroyed you too. This has to end. Those girls deserve justice. You deserve peace." Silence. Then, in a voice so quiet Gretta barely heard it, "I've tried to forget. Tried so hard to pretend it never happened. I know. But it did happen. And there were others. Not just Lily. At least 2 more girls that we know about. Oh, God." Her mother was crying now, soft sobs that broke Gretta's heart. I wondered. After we moved, I kept seeing stories about missing girls, and I'd wonder if it was him. But I couldn't ask. Couldn't let myself think about it. "Will you talk to me? Tell me what you remember." A long pause. "Come tomorrow, afternoon. I need time to prepare myself." "Thank you, Mom. Don't thank me yet. I don't know if I can do this. Don't know if I'm strong enough." "You are. You survived it. You kept the secret for 60 years even though it hurt you. That took strength. Now use that strength to break the silence." They hung up. Gretta sat in the truck and cried. For her mother, for the girls, for her grandfather, for the decades of pain that could have been avoided if someone had been brave enough to speak up sooner. But she wasn't waiting anymore. Tomorrow she'd talk to her mother. Then she'd visit the 4th location and confirm Karen's burial site. Then she'd take everything to the state police and let the process begin. Marcus Driscoll had lived free for 74 years, but his reckoning was coming. Even if he never saw the inside of a prison, even if he died before prosecution, the world would know what he was. His reputation would be destroyed. His family would carry the shame, and the girls he'd killed would finally be acknowledged, remembered, mourned properly. That night, Gretta checked into a motel and couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about her mother as a 17-year-old girl, watching her friend die, running for her life, and then being told she had to keep silent or face terrible consequences. The trauma of that, carried for 60 years, never shared, never processed, it was almost unbearable to contemplate. And she thought about Stella, Lily, and Karen, 3 teenagers who should have grown up, had careers, families, long lives. Instead, they'd been murdered and buried in unmarked graves while their killer lived comfortably. The injustice of it burned. But so did Gretta's determination. She would make this right, would give those girls what they deserved, even if it was 60 years too late. Morning came slowly. Gretta drove to Olympia through steady rain, rehearsing what she'd say to her mother. How did you ask someone to relive the worst trauma of their life? How did you convince them that speaking would bring healing rather than more pain? She didn't have good answers. She only knew it had to be done. She reached her mother's house just after 2 in the afternoon. It was a small ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where people minded their own business and nothing dramatic ever happened. Gretta sat in her truck for 5 minutes, gathering courage, then walked to the door and knocked. Her mother answered immediately, as if she'd been waiting right there. She looked older than Gretta remembered. 74 now, her hair completely white, her face lined with worry, but her eyes were the same, watchful, wary, expecting bad news. "Come in," she said quietly. Gretta followed her inside. The house was neat, sparse, with few personal items visible. It looked like a place someone lived without really settling, as if she might need to leave quickly at any moment. They sat at the kitchen table. Her mother made tea with shaking hands, then sat across from Gretta without drinking it. "Tell me what you found," she said finally. So Gretta told her. Everything. The journals, the maps, the 3 graves, the failed attempts to report the crimes, Marcus Driscoll's name. Her mother sat perfectly still through it all, tears running silently down her face. When Gretta finished, her mother spoke in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone much younger, the 17-year-old girl who'd witnessed a murder and been silenced. "I've never told anyone what I saw. Not even your father. Not you. No one but my own father. And he made me promise never to speak of it again. And I haven't. Not in 60 years. I'm asking you to break that promise now, for Lily, for all of them." Her mother looked at her with eyes full of pain and something else, maybe relief. "Tell me what you need me to do." And just like that, Gretta knew they would succeed. Justice was coming. Finally, her mother's name was Linda. Sitting at that kitchen table, holding a cup of tea she couldn't drink, she looked nothing like the terrified 17-year-old who'd witnessed murder. But when she started talking, Gretta could hear that girl in her voice, young, traumatized, desperately wanting to do right, but paralyzed by fear. "It was July," Linda began. "Summer of 1962. I was 17, about to start my senior year. A group of us went camping. 6 kids, no parents. That was normal back then. Kids had more freedom. She paused, gathering strength. Gretta waited, not pushing. Lily Kowalski was my best friend. She was funny, smart, always making plans for the future. She wanted to be a teacher. She was only 14, but she was mature for her age. We all treated her like she was one of us. Another pause. Outside, the rain continued. Marcus Driscoll was there too. He was 20, home from college for the summer. He came from money. Everyone knew the Driscolls. They owned half the county. Marcus was... He seemed nice at first, charming. He paid attention to Lily, which made her feel special. She had a crush on him. Linda's hands tightened on the teacup. The second day, Marcus suggested he and Lily go explore a side trail. Just the two of them. Some of us thought it was inappropriate. She was only 14, but Lily wanted to go. She was excited that an older guy liked her. Gretta felt her chest tighten, but stayed quiet. I didn't trust him. I can't explain why. Just a feeling. So I followed them. Stayed far enough back that they wouldn't notice, but close enough to see where they went. Linda's voice dropped to almost a whisper. They stopped in a clearing near a ravine. I heard them arguing. Lily sounded upset, like she was trying to get away from him. I moved closer, trying to stay hidden. And then I saw... She stopped, her face grey. Gretta reached across the table and took her mother's hand. He grabbed her. She was trying to leave and he grabbed her arm, hard. She pulled away and he pushed her. Not hard, I don't think, but she was close to the edge and she lost her balance. She fell. Linda was shaking now, the memory clearly as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. It wasn't far, maybe 10 feet down to a ledge, but she hit her head on a rock. I heard the sound. I'll never forget that sound. And then she wasn't moving. What did Marcus do? He climbed down to her, checked her pulse or breathing, I couldn't tell. Then he just stood there, for maybe a minute, just standing over her body. And then he looked up, straight at where I was hiding. Gretta's stomach turned. He saw you. I don't know, maybe. Or maybe he just sensed someone was there. But I panicked. I ran all the way back to our campsite, grabbed my things and hiked out to the road. I was terrified he would come after me. Did you tell anyone? I went straight to my father, told him everything. He took me seriously, thank God, but then Linda's voice broke. Then he went to talk to Owen Driscoll, Marcus's father. I don't know what was said, but when Dad came home, he was different, defeated. He told me we couldn't report it, that the Driscolls would deny everything, would make it look like Lily's death was an accident, would claim I was lying or mistaken. And if I pushed it, if I testified, they would make sure I was blamed somehow. Or worse. He believed them? He believed they had the power to do what they threatened. And he was probably right. This was 1962. The Driscolls owned the sheriff, the prosecutor, half the businessmen in the county. Who would listen to a teenage girl accusing a wealthy family's son? Linda wiped her eyes. So we moved. Dad got a transfer, and we left within 2 weeks. I was told never to speak about what I'd seen, never to contact Lily's family, never to even think about it. And for 60 years, I've tried to do exactly that. Tried to bury it so deep that it couldn't hurt me anymore. Did it work? Linda laughed, a harsh sound. What do you think? I've spent my entire adult life looking over my shoulder. I couldn't form close relationships because I was carrying this secret. I pushed you away because I was afraid if you got too close, you'd see it in me. I ruined my life trying to protect myself from a threat that probably stopped being real decades ago. She looked at Gretta with red-rimmed eyes. Your grandfather tried to protect me, but in doing so, he trapped both of us in that moment. We never escaped what happened that day. We just pretended we had. Gretta squeezed her mother's hand. You can escape it now, by telling the truth, by making sure Marcus Driscoll faces what he did. Linda took a shaky breath. You really think anyone will listen after all this time? I know they will, because I won't give them a choice. Her mother looked at her for a long moment, seeing her clearly maybe for the first time in years. You're brave. Braver than I was. Braver than your grandfather. I had better examples to learn from. You survived. That took courage, too. Tell me what happens next. I need you to write down everything you remember. Every detail, no matter how small. Then I need you to come with me to the state police and make a formal statement. And eventually, you'll probably have to testify if this goes to trial. And if I can't, if I'm too afraid, then I'll do this without you. I'll use everything else I have and fight as hard as I can. But it will be harder. Your testimony is the strongest evidence. You're the only living witness. Linda sat quietly, wrestling with a decision she'd been avoiding for 60 years. Finally, she nodded. I'll do it. Not because I'm brave, but because I'm tired. Tired of carrying this secret. Tired of letting that family escape consequences. Tired of living half a life, because I'm afraid to live a full one. That's all the bravery you need. They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. Linda wrote out her full account, while Gretta organized her documentation. By evening, they had a comprehensive file. Witness testimony, physical evidence locations, journals, letters, maps, photographs, and a timeline that told the complete story. Tomorrow they would take it to the authorities, and Marcus Driscoll's long escape from justice would finally end. Before visiting the police, Gretta needed to confirm the fourth location. Her grandfather had marked it on the map, but she needed photographic evidence and GPS coordinates for every site. The case had to be airtight. Linda insisted on coming. I spent 60 years hiding. I'm done with that. They hiked together into the mountains, following Gretta's GPS to the coordinates her grandfather had marked for Karen Price. The location was remote, even more isolated than the others, deliberately chosen to be difficult to find. After 4 hours of hiking, they reached it. Another cairn of stones, this one more weathered than the others. 60 years of forest growth had nearly obscured it, but it was there. Someone had been buried in this place, hidden away and forgotten. Gretta documented everything, while Linda stood silent nearby, bearing witness. When she finished, Linda walked to the cairn and knelt beside it. I'm sorry we didn't stop him sooner, she said quietly. I'm sorry you died alone and scared. But we're going to make sure people know what happened to you. We're going to make sure he pays. They hiked back in silence, both carrying the weight of what they'd found. 4 graves, 4 girls, 1 man responsible. And finally, after more than 60 years, the truth was coming to light. The next morning, Gretta and Linda drove to the Washington State Police headquarters in Everett. They'd called ahead and been connected with Detective Sarah Mitchell from the Cold Case Unit. She met them in a conference room, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. Ms. Lowen, Ms. Brennan, you said on the phone you have information about multiple homicides from the 1960s? Gretta opened her file. 4 homicides. Stella Marsh, 1959. Lily Kowalski, 1962. Karen Price, 1965. And possibly others we don't know about, all attributed to the same perpetrator, Marcus Driscoll. She laid out everything. The journals, the maps, the GPS coordinates, the photographs, the failed police reports, the evidence of institutional cover-up. And then Linda told her story, the first time she'd spoken it aloud to someone in authority in 60 years. Detective Mitchell listened without interrupting, taking notes, her expression growing darker as the story unfolded. When they finished, she sat back and was quiet for a long moment. "This is substantial," she said finally. "The documentation is thorough. The witness testimony is credible. The physical evidence exists and can be verified. The challenge is going to be prosecution." "Because of time?" Gretta asked. "Time and evidence degradation. We'll need to exhume the remains, which requires court orders. We'll need forensic analysis to confirm identities and cause of death. And even if everything checks out, we're talking about crimes from over 60 years ago. Witnesses are dead or unreliable. Physical evidence has degraded. Defense attorneys will argue that a fair trial is impossible." "But it's still possible. It's possible. Washington has no statute of limitations on murder. If we can prove Marcus Driscoll killed these girls, we can prosecute. But I'll be honest, the odds of conviction are lower because of the time past. What's more likely is that we confirm the crimes, issue charges, and Marcus either dies before trial or accepts a plea agreement." Linda spoke up. "Even if he never goes to prison, the world needs to know what he did. These families need to know what happened to their daughters." Detective Mitchell nodded. "Agreed. And that part I can guarantee. If this case is as solid as it looks, we'll be going public with it. The media will cover it extensively. Marcus Driscoll's reputation will be destroyed, regardless of whether we get a conviction." She stood. "Give me a week. I need to brief my superiors, consult with the prosecutor's office, and start the process of securing court orders for exhumation. In the meantime, don't discuss this with anyone else. If Marcus or his family get wind of the investigation before we're ready, they'll lawyer up and start fighting every step." "What about the families?" Gretta asked. "Stella's, Lily's, Karen's. Don't they deserve to know?" "They do, and they will. But we need to notify them officially, through proper channels, after we've confirmed the evidence. I promise you, they'll be told as soon as we're ready." Gretta and Linda left the police station, feeling something neither had felt in a long time. Hope. The machinery of justice was slow, but it was finally moving. Over the following week, events unfolded rapidly. Detective Mitchell's team secured court orders. Forensic teams were dispatched to the 4 locations Gretta had documented. Remains were carefully exhumed and transported to the State Forensics Lab. DNA analysis confirmed the identities: Stella Marsh, Lily Kowalski, Karen Price, and a 4th victim who'd never been reported missing, a teenage runaway named Amy Chen, whose disappearance in 1967 had been attributed to her leaving home voluntarily. 5 victims in 8 years, a serial killer who'd operated with impunity because wealth and power had protected him. On the 10th day, Detective Mitchell called Gretta. "We're issuing an arrest warrant for Marcus Driscoll, and we're going public tomorrow. I wanted you to know first." "Thank you," Gretta said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for listening." "No. Thank you. Without your grandfather's documentation and your courage to come forward, these girls would have stayed forgotten. You gave them back their names." The next day the news broke. Marcus Driscoll, age 74, arrested for 4 counts of murder dating back to 1959. The story dominated headlines across Washington and beyond. A wealthy businessman revealed as a serial killer, a decades-long cover-up exposed, 4 families finally receiving answers, Marcus Driscoll was led from his Seattle home in handcuffs, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. He looked old, confused, diminished, nothing like the powerful young man who'd killed 4 girls and walked away. Justice, finally. The trial took 18 months to prepare. Gretta attended every hearing, every pre-trial motion, sitting in the courtroom gallery with her mother beside her. They'd become close again during this process, the shared mission bridging the decades of distance between them. Marcus Driscoll pled not guilty, as his expensive lawyers advised. But the evidence was overwhelming. DNA from the remains matched family members. Linda's testimony was powerful and credible, and perhaps most damning, her grandfather's journals and documents proved institutional knowledge and cover-up. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Gretta watched as prosecutors laid out the complete timeline. A young man from a wealthy family who'd killed repeatedly, protected each time by his father's money and influence. A system that had failed at every level. Police who'd been bribed, prosecutors who'd looked the other way, officials who'd valued reputation over justice. On the 21st day, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 4 counts of murder. Marcus Driscoll, now 76, was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. He'd die in custody, his comfortable retirement replaced by a cell. It wasn't perfect justice. The girls couldn't be brought back, but it was something. Acknowledgement, accountability, truth. After the sentencing, Gretta met with the families. Stella Marsh's niece, now 68, embraced her with tears streaming down her face. My grandmother died, never knowing what happened to her daughter. She carried that pain her whole life. At least now we can bury Stella properly. Can say goodbye. Lily Kowalski's younger brother, 73, shook Gretta's hand with both of his. Thank you for not letting them stay forgotten, for fighting when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Karen Price's mother, 94 and frail, could barely speak, but held Gretta's hand and whispered, I knew she hadn't just run away. I always knew. Thank you for proving I was right. Amy Chen's sister, who'd spent 50 years believing Amy had simply disappeared into the streets, told Gretta, I used to dream about her, wondering if she was alive somewhere. It's terrible to know she's been dead all this time, but at least the wondering is over. The media coverage was intense, but ultimately positive. Stories emerged about other cold cases being reopened, other families finding hope that their missing loved ones might finally be found. Gretta became, reluctantly, a public figure, the woman who'd inherited her grandfather's secrets and chosen to expose them. She gave one major interview to a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the complete story. In it, she spoke about her grandfather honestly, his failures and his guilt, his attempts at redemption, and his final act of courage in leaving the truth for her to find. He wasn't a hero, she said. He made terrible choices that let a killer operate freely for years. But he also carried the weight of those choices for his entire life. And in the end, he did what he could to make it right. He left me the tools to finish what he couldn't. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it means something. 6 months after the trial, Gretta returned to the cabin. She'd kept the property, though she'd debated selling it. But something about the place felt important now. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a memorial. She hiked up with a stonemason and her mother. Together, they visited each of the 4 sites. At each one, they placed a proper marker. Granite stones engraved with names and dates, official acknowledgements that these girls had existed and mattered. At Stella's grave, Stella Marsh, 1943 to 1959, beloved daughter and friend, forever remembered. At Lily's, Lily Kowalski, 1948, 1962. Taken too soon. Never forgotten. At Karen's. Karen Price, 1950, 1965. Lost but found again. Rest in peace. At Amy's. Amy Chen, 1951, 1967. Gone from home, but not from memory. You are loved. The families held small ceremonies at each site, finally able to mourn properly after decades of uncertainty. Gretta stood back and watched, feeling the weight she'd carried since finding her grandfather's journals finally begin to lift. Her mother stood beside her at Amy's memorial, the last one they visited. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Linda asked quietly. "Bringing all this pain back up?" "Yes," Gretta said without hesitation. "Truth is better than comfortable silence. Always." They hiked back to the cabin together in the late afternoon light. It looked different now, less ominous, more peaceful. Just a small building in the mountains, where an old man had kept watch over secrets he couldn't bear to reveal, but couldn't bring himself to forget. Gretta had decided to donate the cabin to the state park system with one condition, that it be maintained as a memorial and education center about the case. A place where people could learn about the importance of speaking up, of not letting power silence truth, of giving victims a voice even decades after they're gone. She unlocked the door one last time and stood in the threshold, thinking about the journey that had begun here. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a solitary woman living a small, quiet life, asking no questions and expecting no answers. Now she was someone who'd fought for justice and won. Someone who'd reconnected with her mother after years of estrangement. Someone who'd given 4 girls and their families peace. Her grandfather's pocket watch still sat on the mantel, stopped at 3:47. Gretta picked it up and wound it carefully. The mechanism clicked to life, the second hand beginning its sweep around the face. Time hadn't stopped after all. It had just been waiting. Outside, the sun was setting through the trees, painting the clearing gold and orange. Gretta locked the cabin door and started down the trail with her mother, talking quietly about what they'd cook for dinner, what they'd do tomorrow, what movies they might watch together that weekend. Normal conversation between a mother and daughter who'd finally found their way back to each other. Behind them, the mountains held 4 marked graves, where once there had been only secrets. 4 names spoken aloud, where once there had been only silence. And 1 man in prison, where once there had been only impunity. Justice wasn't perfect. It wasn't complete. It had come 60 years too late to save anyone. But it had come. And that, Gretta thought as she walked down the mountain in the fading light, was enough. The girls were remembered. The truth was known. The silence was broken. And finally, after all these years, there was peace.